all natural resources in Chelan County. Our board and staff work with local landowners and communities to provide technical and financial assistance for soil, water, forest, fish, and wildlife conservation efforts, and we currently serve all of Chelan County. Next slide. So just a little more information on the type of projects that and programs that we offer to the community. Feel free to reach out to us anytime to learn more. We have a website. Also, the phone number is up there, and we also have an info@cascadiacd.org email address that several of us check. So lots of different ways to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear about any project ideas you have on your property, or just answer any general conservation questions for you.
So coming up, we have 3 more sessions after tonight. So next Monday is managing invasive weeds, which obviously can be a huge problem, especially in native planting settings. And on the 22nd, Mel Asher is going to be presenting about native plant selection and maintenance. She'll talk some about pollinators as well. So, and then on March 29th, we're going to have a panel discussion with Julie Sanderson, Al Murphy, and Betsy Dudash, who was presented last week. Mel's not going to be able to make it for that. And we'll send out the questionnaire prior to that, so we can have kind of preload some questions, but it'll be more of a Q&A session for all the presenters. So hope you can join all of those. So tonight we have Al Murphy. He's going to be talking about using native plants in a Firewise landscape. And Al's, one of his passions for years has been assisting communities in reducing losses from wildfire. He's currently a master gardener. He's a retired forester, spent 37 years with Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, working in most of the Western states. He spent 20 years with the National Fire Overhead Teams, and when he was with the National Interagency Fire Center, he was providing technical and financial assistance to local communities. So some of the resources he's going to share with you, it's not something he found on Google, it's things he actually wrote. He wrote some of the books and booklets he's going to share with you. And hopefully he's also going to have time to share with us some of his experience with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. I think that's the right labs. So welcome, Al, and let me stop sharing and we'll turn it over to Al.
Thank you. I will get us lined up here. And where'd that go? Okay, there we go. Is just to add a little bit to what Kirk was saying is, I spent a lot of time with fire. That's what my background is from college, and I spent a lot of time with the research station, studying different Aspen specifically and prescribed fire. And have a lot of experience with prescribed fire. My last job with the Bureau of Land Management was the Chief of Community Assistance, as Kirk was saying, and I spent a lot of time on Firewise and trying to figure out how communities could protect themselves and how people could prevent homes from burning. Okay, so I encourage you to ask questions and chat. We're going to have about 3, 4, at least 4, maybe 5 breaks throughout this thing. And so I'd like to get your input. I really thrive on good dialogue. So I really look forward to that. This presentation is not the technical type of presentation. If you're interested in that, I can sure give that at a later date. I have one that gets it down into the fire science, but this is more of a presentation on how basically to be Firewise and how to incorporate native plants into your Firewise situation or your landscape situation. So with that, we'll kind of kick off, and what I wanted to do was get you to understand the advantages of using native vegetation. I don't expect anybody to have 100% native vegetation around their home. I think that'd be kind of challenging. Unless you live out in the boonies somewhere way far away, it's kind of hard to do. But I think there's some opportunities to incorporate native vegetation into a landscape. They save water, they save homes, the right type of vegetation. They enrich habitat for almost every doggone animal you can possibly think of, and all of the good bugs, if you will. They offer a lot of opportunity for having a rich environment and making your landscape part of a natural environment. The other thing is a lot of native plants don't take nearly the maintenance that non-natives take. I didn't say no maintenance, I said reduced maintenance. When you stop maintaining a landscape, that's when it becomes a fire hazard. So with that, our purpose here today is, I gotta move something, is to share information on planting selected fire-resistant native vegetation to create a safe and beautiful landscape. A lot of people think that when you have a Firewise, fire-resistant landscape, it's denuded. There's no vegetation. The contrary, the opposite is true. You can have lots and lots of vegetation around your home. You just want to pick the right type of vegetation. You all know we live here in Central Washington. It's a nice fire-prone environment, and every year something happens. But if we can do the right thing around our home, there is a 97% chance that your home will not be damaged by a threatening wildfire. A couple of definitions. I have about 4 definitions that I think could be important just to make sure that we're all talking the same thing and using the same language. You can read better than I can. Native plants are the things that have been around here for literally thousands of years. The last glaciers and the last floods were about 13,000 years, so most of the native indigenous plants have been around here for at least that length of time. On the contrary, a naturalized plant is something that is doing well. It can grow on its own. It's an exotic. Two that I think, just throw these out for you, 2 exotic or naturalized vegetations is, one is dandelions. If we were in a live audience, I would ask, when do you think dandelions came across? Well, you know what? They were on the first ship that landed at Plymouth Rock. There was dandelions on there, and they came from Holland. And people brought those thinking that they would need them as medicine and foods. So they've become very naturalized. And I would be willing to bet that everybody here has seen a dandelion and can recognize a dandelion. They're not native, but they are definitely naturalized. A couple other definitions. Xeric. Xeric just means low water. It doesn't take a lot of water. A xeriscape is a landscape that doesn't use a lot of water. And in case you didn't know, we have some xeric landscapes around here east of the Columbia River, just for the heck of it. Another word that I throw out there, biodiversity. It just means a variety of living things, that lots of different animals, plants, so that when you have biodiversity, you have something that is stable, something that generally is resilient. Speaking of that, let's use a couple words over here. A lot of people throw around fire terms, and I think it's important to define those. Fire resistant means it's a plant that withstands fire, okay? It doesn't burn very easily. And we'll talk about the attributes of that later. And some plants can be all of these, by the way. But let's look at differently. A lot of people get fire resistant and fire resilient mixed up. Fire resilient means it's adapted to fire. It can resist damage from fire, such as a Ponderosa pine tree. In fact, I use Ponderosa pine on those last 3, the resilient, tolerant, and adapted. Ponderosa pine has got all kinds of vegetative characteristics that make it so that it's fire tolerant. It can withstand a lot of fire, particularly when it's old. And we'll talk about that more later. Fire adapted. Here's one that I'll use a different example. I'll use Populus tremuloides. How about aspen? Okay. If I use a Latin word, somebody slap me. Okay. I will not try to use any Latin or scientific names. But Populus tremuloides. Aspen is a tree that is not very fire resilient. It's not fire tolerant. It is fire resistant, but it's very fire adapted because it's a root system that you're growing. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but it's a root system. When you see an aspen stand, it's one living plant. The entire clone is what it's called, is one living plant, and they're all hooked together beneath the root. If there's more questions on that, I'd love to talk on aspen for a long, long time, but I'm not going to. Another one that I think just needs a little more shrub step is once you get west, once you get east of the Columbia River, for the most part, we're out into the shrub step. We start losing trees, and a shrub is any plant with multiple stems arising out of the ground versus a tree. A tree has just got a single stem. Shrubs have multiple stems coming up out of the ground. And a steppe is just a large, flat, grassy area, barren of trees pretty much. There's always exceptions to every rule. And by the way, when I say that, when I say some things and somebody's going to say, well, actually, well, I don't care about actually. We're just talking in general terms, okay? So I can be corrected, and there's always an exception to everything in nature, okay? So now I want to talk about a little bit about the east side of Washington. It's a very unique area, very unique for a lot of reasons. Geology and geography. It's very unique. Is the geology of this area is unique because we've got a set of mountains, a mountain arc, if you will, of volcanoes. And just on the other side of that, the west side is an ocean. I think everybody probably knows that, but combine that geology, which is it really rocks, by the way. That's the way to remember that. But geography is where it's at, dude. Okay, so remember that. If you take the geology and the geography and combine those two, what you get is you get a climate. Because of the mountains form, I think everybody knows it rains on the west side, it doesn't rain nearly as much. So we got a climate. From that climate, we get weather. From that weather, we get certain type of vegetation. Excuse me, I skipped one. From that weather, we get a certain type of soil as the rocks and what have you disappear. So we go from geology to climate to weather to soil, then to plants. And then from plants, then we go down to animals. And over here, if you get up close to the Cascades, we got a mixed conifer stands. And we'll talk about those more here in just about 30 seconds. And then as you get down the mountain a little further, we get into the dry forest, the Ponderosa Pine forest. And then when you get down to the Wenatchee area and further east, you're into the sage steppe. And speaking of sage steppe, what we generally have out there, what we're all used to seeing is sagebrush. And here's sagebrush and bitterbrush are probably the two most common. In the olden days, in between the sage, we had different types of grasses, primarily bunch grass. But if anybody recognizes this is a new grass that has come in ever since about 1880. Cheatgrass, an annual grass that takes over really bad. And we can talk about that later. But the sage steppe is an area where we've got somewhere between 8 and say 12 inches of moisture a year. We got a tremendous amount of variation in that. And so, but generally around here, I think Wenatchee is the annual precip of 9. So it can vary one way or the other. Now, when you start moving from the sage steppe up into the dry forest, particularly here in central Washington, we got a transition zone, and that's called an ecotone. That's another big word that it's worth 25 cents at least. But that ecotone is a transition zone. It ain't shrub and it ain't forest. It's halfway in between. It's got some of each. But it's a common area around here. Up here, I live on Badger Mountain, and I live in this particular ecotone, this transition between forest and rangeland, or shrub steppe, I should say. And again, the moisture in this area is probably never gets up to 20 inches, but it's somewhere greater than 10 and less than 20, up in that neighborhood. Then we go up a little higher. We go across the Columbia River up into the forest a little bit, and we just get into where pure forest. Now we're into the dry forest. The primary species there is Ponderosa Pine. And it's adapted. It's fire adapted, it's fire resistant, it's fire resilient, and that's what it's been that way for years and years. We got a range of moisture in there of probably somewhere between 15 and say 20, 25, something like that. And it varies with slope and aspect. But it's an area that's got a unique soil, it's got a unique vegetation. And I forgot to say that, but I was getting at it. Same thing is true with the sage steppe. It's got a unique soil and it's got a unique vegetation. This is more a more mesic, if you will, more water area than the area down below in the sage steppe. Then we go even higher. Then we get up into the mixed conifer, where we got Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and true firs, larch, and several other species. We're probably up in the 30-inch rainfall, something like that. And again, the soil changes up here. We got a much more acidic soil than we did down on the sage steppe, where it's almost towards a basic. Maybe I should say this is acid and the other one is more towards a base. And it changes. And so we got different plants. And I would offer one thing. When a xeric plant in the mixed conifer would be a water hog down in the sage steppe. And something that is a water hog down in the sage steppe may be a xeric plant up in the mixed conifer. So the plants and the soils, elevation, all that dictate what type of plant grows best in those areas. It's going to be challenging. I'm going to throw out several different plants as we go through here. And some of them will fit better in some areas than they do other areas. I'm going to talk about plants in about 4 different categories. Trees, I think it's a single stem. We call that a bole, if you will, B-O-L-E, and shrubs, which have multiple stems. Those are the 2 woody types of vegetation that we'd be dealing with around here. And then once we get below that, we got grasses, and then we got forbs. Forbs are herbaceous perennials and annuals. Okay, we'll talk a lot more, trying to make this up, and we're going to go through this just a little bit at a time. So what I'd like to do there, just see if there's any questions right now about the different zones or the biomes. Biomes is a life area with the different types of moisture and vegetation in them. If there's any questions on that so far, you can get them to Kirk or Val. And if not, we'll just keep going.
You can type them into the chat if you have any questions now or at any time.
Yeah, anytime. So barring no questions, I'll give you a second.
Al, so how far west did you go with the dry forest?
How far west did I go to the dry forest? I would go up, well, that again varies on slope and elevation. But you can go west up, to about Leavenworth, up in that general area. Once you start getting above Leavenworth across that line, and Chelan halfway up the lake, maybe. On the south side, you can go almost all the way up the lake on the dry forest, Lake Chelan, that is. And on the north aspect, you can only go about halfway up the lake, and then you start changing. So aspect and elevation make a huge difference. The other thing, kind of unique about Lake Chelan, if you ever think about it, how much higher you think Stehekin is than Chelan? It's a lake, okay, so water seeks its own level. So there's really not much difference. But you go into the Cascade Mountain Range, 55 miles from Chelan to Stehekin. And what happens? The moisture content goes up immensely. So by the time you don't gain any elevation going from Chelan to Stehekin, but you sure gain a lot of moisture. So you go from Chelan, I would consider it basically a shrub step, or maybe that ecotone in between. But by the time you get up into Stehekin, you're into a mixed conifer forest. Gain no elevation. Remember that thing about geography and geology? There you go. Okay. We'll go. Now I want to talk just a little about, I want to talk about the attributes of fire-resistant vegetation. Something I learned a long, long time ago. I started talking about specific plants right off the bat. In fact, the plant I started talking about was Oregon grape as a shrub. And we'll show some pictures of that in a minute. But I started talking about that, and as soon as I started talking about that, there was somebody in the audience that attacked me right away and says, I hate Oregon grape. It's terrible. I like it, don't like it for all these reasons. Then we went on for 15 minutes about what the negative attributes of Oregon grape were. So I learned a lesson. Quit talking about any particular brand of plant and just talk about the attributes of plants that are good for fire resistance. So I'll go through this. This is going to be the closest I'm getting into fire behavior characteristics by talking about these attributes. We're going to start with low growing. A low growing plant is a great fire resistant attribute because it's down out of the wind and it's not getting supplied with fresh supply of oxygen all the time. And as I'm sure you all know, for a fire to burn, it's got to have heat and oxygen and a fuel. So if we can get it down close to the ground where there's not a lot of oxygen being put in all the time, the wind, that it's less likely to burn hot. It's less likely to burn intense. Okay, open configuration is another attribute. And why is that good? Because, well, when you have an open configuration, take my fingers, for example. I've got them spread out like that. And if this finger was on fire, it's a long way from this finger here. But if I move them closer together, the ability of heat to transfer from one finger to the next finger gets better. So if we have stuff that's spread out, it's hard for energy, heat, to transfer from one thing to another. That's kind of pretty simple, right? Because you all know radiation decreases inversely proportional to the square root of the distance, right? That is the right formula, but you don't have to remember that. Radiation decreases the further it goes away. The further you separate things out, the harder it is to light something else on fire. Moisture content, succulent parts, that's a great attribute of fire-resistant plants. Anything that has a lot of moisture in it, if you take a big kettle and put it on the stove, I'll bet you it takes longer for it to get hot than it does a little teacup, right? So it takes a lot longer to heat something up to its kindling temperature if it's got a lot of moisture in it. So that's a great attribute. The next one is water-like sap. Sap is from conifers, as we all know, is sticky and it's got some chemicals in it. And if you're a good Boy Scout or Girl Scout, you're always taught to pick up a piece of pitchy wood and always have that with you. But on the contrary, a lot of hardwoods, broadleaf trees, have really water-like sap. It doesn't burn at all. It's water. In fact, it becomes, I'm trying to think of another word to use, it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to heat that up and move it away. Broadleafs, anything with broadleafs on it is also, generally speaking, now there's some exceptions to this because some have some chemicals in them, but 99% of the ones that are around here, in fact, 100% of the ones that are around here, are great fire-resistant plants. It takes a lot of energy to heat a broadleaf plant up. The same reason it takes a lot of energy to heat up an herbaceous plant part. And I'll talk about some plants, specifically lupine. It's got a high moisture content. And by the time you dry it out, if you were to take a lupine plant, put it in the oven and bake it at 450 till done, it would be almost nothing there. In fact, lupine has about 450% moisture content. So think about it. By the time that gets down and is totally desiccated, there's nothing there to burn. So it's got to spend, the fire's got to spend a lot of energy to get the moisture off. And then by the time it gets the moisture off, there's nothing there to burn anyway. Make sense? Okay. The other thing is a lot of plants have a very low accumulation of dead material. And that's the kind of plants you want to, for example, take a dogwood. It's a nice tight bark plant and it's pretty clean unless it's dropping all its leaf. Compare that to a sagebrush bush, okay? There's a lot of stuff around a sage. And the last one is tight bark. The reason tight bark is great, it doesn't have air that allows a fire to burn and get around it. Make sense? Okay, here's another way of looking at it from the standpoint of, you know, fire resistant versus fire prone vegetation. Is short is better than tall, right? I think that's pretty obvious. I'm just going to go through these real quick. And herbaceous versus woody. If it's herbaceous plants, the only way they can stand up is if they have pressure inside the stem that holds them up. Whereas woody has hard stuff. It doesn't have to have moisture in it to keep it standing up. Deciduous versus evergreen. Most evergreens, not all, have very thin, small leaves and have chemical compounds that really allow themselves to burn very easily. There are some evergreens, for example, as soon as you start to heat them up, they produce a vapor that is extremely flammable. True firs are an example of that. Is if you heat a true fir up, it puts off a gas, and the gas actually burns before the plant does. Spread out versus very thick, dense. I'll give you an example. Probably the worst you could ever, on a scale from 1 to 100, where 100 is bad, I would offer an arbovita bush. Is probably thick, dense, and is really compact with a lot of dead material versus something that's spread out. Something, again, like a dogwood is very, very fire resistant. Tight bark versus loose woody bark. I already talked about that. Watery sap versus thick gummy sap. Again, the chemicals in that are very flammable and a great thing to have with you if you're taught by the Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts how to build a fire in the woods. Okay, now we're going to shift gears a little bit here. Now this is going to be the most technical research-based stuff that I'm going to present to you. It's called the home ignition zone. And I will start off with a researcher named Jack Cullen came up with this concept about, it's probably 20 years ago now, something like that. And what he did, he went out up into the Northwest Territories, had some areas where they had cut the trees off, and he constructed some wooden structures. And he had them constructed at specific distances from an extremely thick forest of jack pine. Jack pine is kind of like lodgepole pine. In fact, you would probably never be able to tell the difference if you didn't know where you were. These forests were extremely thick. So what he did, he would light the forest off, run it at these structures, and through multitude of trials and errors, he found that if you had a structure that was more than 100 feet from the most intense crown fire they could generate, it would not sustain a fire. That's an important thing to remember, 100 feet. Now that would be on flat ground and slopes up to about 20 degrees, if you will. And it changes if you start getting up the very steep slopes, that distance changes. But on flat ground or 20% slope, 100 feet is a safe distance for what that amounts to is the radiant heat won't catch a wooden structure on fire. And then some other people took that and moved it to the next step. What they did is they developed 3 zones, 3 landscape zones, zone 1, 2, and 3. Out in zone 3, which is a distance of 30 to 100 feet from a home, the idea there is to have, if a fire does start, is to have a low intensity fire. I could give you some numbers in BTUs per foot per second, but basically a 3-foot flame length or less. Okay, that's not a very tall flame. You know, a 3-foot flame, think about it, it's about as long as my arm, okay? And that's all, if you can keep the flame at that length out in that zone 3, that is absolutely wonderful. As it moves into zone 2, and we'll talk about some specific type of vegetation to go in there, we don't want a fire to spread. So we got an objective in the first one out here is keep it at low intensity. We move into here, the idea, if it does, something does catch on fire, it won't spread from one shrub, tree to another. So we keep it distance away, and we'll get into some specifics about that. And then the zone right around the house, the 0 to 5 feet, we want stuff in there that doesn't catch on fire. It doesn't mean it has to be bare, but we want herbaceous ground cover and green stuff in there, or inorganic mulch. We'll talk about that more. So that's at zone 1. And the idea is there are no ignitions in there. We don't want anything ignitable. So now what we do is, well, this is just a summary of what I just said. And it's talking about the vegetation out there. That stuff right close to the house, we want non-flammable vegetation or inorganic mulches, okay? That's 5 to 30 feet from the house. We want well spaced, and I'll show you specifically what we're getting at. Pruned up, green, and no dead fuels. I'll get more specific on that. And then out that 30 to 100 feet, well spaced native vegetation that's pruned up, and we don't want stuff that can't get up into the crowns, and native stuff is great out there. So let's talk about the types of vegetation. The categories of vegetation that best fit in these different landscape zones. Now, if you look at the categories of vegetation, then you don't get hung up on what brand, what specific plant we need to be there. But ground covers that have the attributes that I talked about, and we'll get into this stuff more. But ground covers that, you know, they're short plants, they're close to the ground, they don't have the ability for a lot of oxygen or wind to get at them. We want herbaceous perennials or annuals, forbs, they have a lot of moisture in them, or herbaceous vines, or turf grasses, those types of things. Those are the things that we want in zone 1. And again, a lot of people used to think that when you say fire resistant landscaping, we're talking about a bulldozer around the house and push down to bare earth. That's not at all. Some of these are just absolutely beautiful, gorgeous homes that have beautiful landscaping. Zone 1, again, here's some of the items that, you know what, there we go. My pictures are keep getting in the wrong spot. They're moving around on me. The vegetation, that 0 to 10 feet, by the way, I say 10 feet to 5 feet. The reason I make a difference there is if you built a house out of a flammable material, you want a little more distance. But if you have like a 1 hour siding, you know, hardy siding or something like that, that doesn't burn readily, it's got a 1 hour sheetrock. I think most of us know about sheetrock. Sheetrock doesn't burn. Most of it's a 1 hour time lag for it to burn, catch on fire. So depending on the structure, what the structure is made out of, whether it should be 5 feet or 10 feet. So in those areas, you don't want trees or shrubs, okay? I was showing you what you had, ground covers, etc. Don't use organic mulch. Use inorganic mulch. Let me make my pitch now. Going back to my geology background, is one of my favorites is a rock called scoria. You probably know it as red lava rock or red cinders. It's not lava, but it's cinders. It's rock that gets thrown out of volcanic It's lava that's coming up through the soil or through the ground and hits a pocket of water, and then it just splatters. And it splatters out a short distance, and it turns red because the iron in that rock oxidized, it rusts. The iron rusts in the rock, and that's why it turns red, okay? It's a great rock. There's 5 reasons why it is an outstanding mulch. It holds the moisture in the soil very well because that rock is 50% air. It's 50. You ever pick up red scoria or red cinder rock? It's really light, and sometimes it actually floats. So it holds the moisture in the soil. That's an issue here in Central Washington. It keeps the temperature down. It blocks the solar radiation. It keeps the weeds down. It adds nutrients to the soil. And it doesn't burn. It doesn't go away. It doesn't blow away like woody mulch does. And the, 7th or 8th thing, cats don't use it for their litter box, okay? So there are 7 or 8 good reasons to use it. And another one, you don't have to replace it annually. It's there for a long period of time. Okay. Forbs and wildflowers. Okay, wildflowers, just another name for forbs, or the vice versa. They're interchangeable from my standpoint. And where they grow out in nature is it's the inner areas between the bunch grasses and the shrubs. That's where you find them. And so think about that. They are outstanding for beneficial insects to have around, pollinators and all the good insects that eat up the bad insects that often plague us. The other items that use it is birds for pollination and what have you, and all kinds of different good critters are used to the native vegetation that we have around. And it's foods and medicines. In fact, I'll give you some examples here in a minute about how it's used for different medicines and different foods. What I did, I tried to grab just some examples. And I'm not in love with any one of these particular plants, but they're just examples of native vegetation that I think makes some neat vegetation around. It can make some neat vegetation around the home. Balsam root and lupine, both of these. Lupine is one. Okay, lupine is one that just a little bit of drip irrigation, you can keep this green for a long period of time, a very long period of time. It doesn't take hardly any water, and almost none at all. You go over here, this is balsam root, is one of the first plants to come out in the spring. I'm sure you've all noticed it. And it doesn't take any water. It's got a huge root that goes way down. It goes down about 6 feet. And it's a great plant. Here's a couple of plants, phlox over here and yarrow. Yarrow is a neat plant. It's called an increaser-decreaser. You're going to get a little lesson here on is when the range condition and your yard is in great shape, yarrow will start to disappear. However, if you stop watering it and start walking around on the yard, and it starts to get into poor health, yarrow will increase in abundance. And if you keep walking on it and don't water it and start messing it up more, it will increase to a point, and then all of a sudden it starts decreasing, and it'll disappear from the site and it'll go away, and nothing there be there but weeds, if you will. And then you start watering your yard and it starts coming back. Pretty soon the yarrow will start increasing, and it'll get to a point, and then once your yard gets healthy again, it will start decreasing again. So it's called an increaser-decreaser. That'll be on the test. I'm just teasing. There's a couple of neat plants, I think, here. Clarkia, it's a good early spring plant. And this one over here, fireweed, one of my favorites. We were talking about Alaska. This is, I don't know if it's the state flower of Alaska or not, but it should ought to be. How's that? There's a lot of stories that go with yarrow. Yarrow is a plant that comes in following disturbance. and to use a term, in many cases, it's called a pioneer species. After a disturbance, it's one of the first that gets out there and starts coming on. And if you look at the plant, you see how the flowers are down here? Well, the higher you get up here and it flowers out, and once it gets about here and this starts to flower out, that means you're less than 4 weeks till winter. So you can always tell with a yarrow, or excuse me, a fireweed when you're getting close to winter. You watch this plant work its way up, and when you get here and it starts flowering, and then the seeds, they start to pop out, you know you're getting close to winter. Here's a couple of neat plants. I'll talk a little. Scarlet Gilia is one that it hangs around for a long, long time with just a little tiny bit of water, a drip now and then. And it's one of those that just doesn't take much water at all. Here's another one. Bitterroot is a super neat plant. The Native Americans used this plant a lot. This was a very, very important plant for Native Americans. As a matter of fact, in the spring, the Native Americans had one name for this plant. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce it. But then as it matured, and that name in the spring was a food name. As it moved to summer, it moved towards more bitter and became a medicinal plant. And so they used it for medicine in the summer, and it had a totally different name. So I think that's pretty neat. So depending on what the plant was used for is what they called it. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I went to school at the University of Montana, is where I graduated. One of the professors there told me about the ancient law that went on the books. It was a state law. It was a hanging offense, as a matter of fact, to pick bitterroot, which is kind of, it wasn't for the protection of the plant, by the way. As you can probably guess, it was not a good thing, but perhaps aiming at getting at people's food source and their medicinal purposes. By the way, that law is off the books now. So let's talk about some grasses, native grasses. Most native grasses have a root system that really, really gets down and goes after the water, not only on the surface, but in the subsurface. So most of them are very xeric plants. And the ones out in the sage steppe and up in the lower part of the dry forest are bunch grasses. And we will look at a couple of bunch grasses here real quick. And these grow well around a home. This one here is Sandberg's bluegrass. It's a very fire resistant, fire resilient, and fire tolerant grass. It only gets about 8 inches tall. The other thing that's neat about Sandberg's bluegrass is, you know what? It doesn't provide a seed head most of the time. It doesn't provide a seed head till it gets disturbed. And once you disturb it, it really puts out a lot of seed heads. And so when it's just kicking around and everything's happy and good, it doesn't waste its energy on fruiting bodies. It just produces vegetative bodies. But if you disturb it, burn it, eat it, graze it, whatever, then it'll start producing seed heads. Over here on the right is Idaho Fescue. It's a neat grass. This grass with just a tiny bit of moisture will stay green the entire growing season. It doesn't take a lot. And it only gets, I would say, at maximum height, it's maybe a foot, something to that effect. And it's a pretty green, it's a very fine grass, and it's got pretty seed heads. Here's a couple of grasses that are, well, they're really not grasses, but that's okay. They're graminoids. How's that? They look like grass. Over here is a sedge. In some areas, you would consider sedges to be very, very water hoggish. But up in the mixed conifer type, then not at all. There's some sedges up there that grow in a fairly dry area. These, along with this grass over here, pine grass, these are not water hogs at all in their appropriate setting their biome in the appropriate water regime area. But you take some sedges and you put them out in the sage steppe, and you're talking serious water hogs. This one is kind of an interesting thing about this. This is kind of fun from a fire standpoint. This is a palatable grass to elk, deer, moose, cows, whatever, ungulates. How's that? It's palatable for about 9 years. And after it's been disturbed, it's palatable for about 9 years. When I say disturbed, generally speaking, this grows best and most abundantly underneath the dry forest, under the Ponderosa Pine or even the mixed forest, mixed conifer forest. And guess what? With the fire regime is those areas burn about every 5 to 10 years. And so this grass has really adapted itself to be a valuable, viable food tied right in to the fire-free intervals. So once it gets past its fire-free interval, it's really not a very palatable species at all, and it just starts to take up a lot of space and doesn't do a lot of things. But if it's burned on a regular basis, about the normal fire interval, then it becomes a very palatable species for a lot of different wildlife. So what we're doing here, we're putting down a lot of dots right now. And I'm hoping these dots are starting to make sense, and see if there's any questions right now before we move on to the next couple of stages. I guess first question I would ask, is this making sense?
So Al, do you see the chat there, or want me to read questions to you? So we have several coming in.
I was not, my screen is being totally occupied by the slide presentation.
Yeah.
And so the pictures hide a lot of stuff.
Right. Yeah, no. So what about plant material for a privacy hedge?
Oh, okay. We're going to get into shrubs here in a minute.
Okay, so we'll
Thank you for asking.
We'll come back to that one. So all the plants so far are okay near a house?
Oh yeah. In fact, is all the plants that we've talked about so far are great near a house, and they're great within that zone 1, if you will, because our very next step is we're going to talk about zone 2 and then zone 3. And as you notice, as we go, is the plants start low and they're going to start getting taller as we move away from the house. By the way, I want to make it very, very clear. I'm talking perfection, okay? And there's no such thing as perfection. We can strive for excellence, but we can never achieve perfection. None of us are going to rip out all of our landscape and start new. Okay, so I'll give you some hints later on here of what we can do to mitigate some things that are not the best. In fact, I would offer, there was an example that I dealt with a very good friend of mine. She planted a tree right next to her house when her daughter was born. And it's not the most fire resistant tree in the world. And she says, there's no way in hell I'm going to cut that tree down. That tree is good. And I said, great, that's fine. What we're going to do, and I offered, what if we prune the tree up right above the roof line? So if the crown catches on fire, most of the heat will be above the house, and it will, the heat flux, the heat direction will be up, and it won't be against the house. So we can mitigate that. The other thing that we can do with that particular tree is take a hose and wash all the dry needles out of it and the lower end of it as high as we can reach with the hose and knock that stuff down. And so it reduces, and then clean out the gutters around the house. So yeah, there's no such thing as perfection. What I'm talking about is what fits best where, okay? There's always exceptions.
Well, that scenario fits in pretty well with Joanne said she has a beautiful cedar tree right behind her house, and she loves it and doesn't want to get rid of it. And, loves all the birds and the shade it gives. So that scenario fits in pretty well with that, I think.
Well, the woman that I was talking about was exactly the same. It was a cedar tree that she had growing up right next to her house, and she did not want to take it out, but we could wash that tree down, in the spring and get it nice and clean, get all the leaves and needles off of the tree, off the roof, and then prune it. And I hope that works for Joanne.
All right.
Okay, we'll move on.
Yep.
Okay, so we talked about landscape zone 1, where we got herbaceous vegetation. We don't have shrubby vegetation. We're into landscape 2, and now we're going to introduce shrubs and small deciduous trees within that 5 to 30 feet from the house. Again, we can have all the stuff in landscape zone 1 plus these additional plants. Anything as we move out, we can add. It's an additive thing, if you will. So again, landscape zone 2 is that area 5 to 30 feet from the house. And I guess there's a couple of really simple statement here. Lean, clean, and green. That area that's within 5 to 30 feet from your house. What lean means, it doesn't have a lot of vegetation, but it's got distance between vegetation. So it's lean. It's clean. It doesn't have dead fuels laying around. And it's green. It's got moisture content in it during the fire season. So lean, clean, and green in that zone out from the house, 30 feet out from the house. So we're looking, I got to give you a couple of things here. Single trees pruned at least 10 feet up, as long as they're tall trees. If you just have single trees that are not very tall, you always want to maintain about 50% of the canopy of it. The canopy is the branches. So you can prune it up so about 50% of the tree still has branches in it. And you can prune it a little bit each year and work your way up on the tree. Single shrubs that are well groomed. You don't want to have a lot of dead material in shrubs. So that's the next one I'll say. Get rid of the dead fuels. And in that 5 to 30 feet from the house, you don't want to have continuous fuels on the ground. So you don't want the fire to be able to move around. I was going to say something about, these single trees. We'll get into that later. We'll talk into that. Shrubs, and I'll throw out a couple of shrubs. And, there's a lot of variety. That most of them, again, are good and xeric plants. They offer a food source for a variety of really nice wildlife, and they provide shade and cover. Starting off is depending on how you want to do it and what zone you live in. Mock orange is one of my favorites. It's a shrub that can grow very tall. This can be used as a hedge, okay? It's not a dense, thick hedge like perhaps Arborvitae, which I really do not like, but it can serve as a hedge, and it all depends on what your objective of your hedge is. If you just need cover during the summertime, this would work fine. But if you need cover during the winter, then maybe we want to be looking at an evergreen shrub. And I don't have any in here, but we can talk about those later. In fact, I don't know of, I do have one in here. We'll talk about that. We'll come up to it. Dogwood is another one. This is a great species for a lot of different animals enjoy this. Very colorful year round. It's got nice red twigs. Nice pretty flowers in the spring. These are both wonderful plants. That this one here is really a great pollinator. Well, they both are. Here's a couple of dry site, more dry site plants. A serviceberry is really a nice shrub. It can go up. It would not be a good, I would not consider this one a good hedge. because it's more open. In fact, this is kind of a neat tree, a shrub in many respects. Look at the leaf of this tree. See how it's serrated to about here, about 2/3 of the way around. It's got that sawtooth-like mark. The edge of a leaf is called the margin. It's got a serrated margin about 2/3 of the way around. And then when you get down here towards the base, it's a very smooth margin. It's called an entire margin. So it's one easy way to tell this plant is to look at it, and the leaves got the serrations coming around, and then you get down towards the bottom, and it's a nice smooth edge, okay? Another one, this serves as a pollinator for many, many different insects and what have you. It's an early spring bloomer, and it's pretty, and it's got nice berries on it. Rose is another one that's a great xeric plant. It can grow well and keep them maintained, and these can be pretty. Most of the ones we see in the wild are not that pretty because they're not groomed or any kind of maintenance on them. I mean, it depends what your definition of pretty is, but I think they're pretty. Here's a couple of, I think I mentioned Oregon grape. I think Oregon grape is a great shrub. It's a small shrub. It gets about 18 inches tall, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's pretty much evergreen. I wouldn't consider it as a hedge type shrub, but it's got lots of berries with it, and it's really, I think, very attractive and very nice. Golden currant, more out in the shrub steppe, another great plant. By the way, if you ever lose power, all you got to do is run an extension cord out to here and plug it into current. That's a joke. Okay. Here is a shrub, shrubby cinquefoil. This is an evergreen shrub. It only gets to be 3 to 4 feet tall, but it depending on how high you want your shrub hedge to be, this could work. It doesn't get very tall, but it could work as a, like a 3 to 4 foot high, what do you call it, a row of, a hedgerow. Not spirea. Spirea wouldn't do the same thing. You see how open it is? It's a nice open plant. Shrubby cinquefoil might do it. Okay, that's the only one I can think of. I can think of a number of non-natives that would provide good hedges that are tall, but I can't think of any natives that are evergreen other than the cinquefoil that would serve as a good hedgerow that are tall. Betsy, do you know of any? Okay. All right. Let's see. On shrubs, one of the things I was going to talk about on shrubs is how far to keep them apart. Is whatever the height of a shrub is, for example, if a shrub is 2 feet tall, you want to double that distance, keep them apart that 4 feet, for example. So from a Firewise standpoint, whatever the height, the mature height of your shrub is, plant them, double that distance apart. The reason I was going to talk about that a little bit earlier was one of the things when a plant burns, a shrub, a tree, one of these trees like these here, or these shrubs here, how long do you think they burn for? I'll tell you, is they don't burn for any more than about 60 seconds. Active, now they'll smolder for an extended period of time, but the maximum heat is only going to be for 60 seconds or less. So think about that, standing by a campfire. Most of us can stand by a raging campfire and stand the heat for almost a minute, can't we? Before we have to totally back up. So it's very challenging if you move plants double their height apart. It's really hard to get the radiant heat to catch something else on fire because the duration of the heat is not long enough. Make sense? Does that come along? I hope it does. Oh yeah, here we go. So now we're starting to connect the dots, and I would offer another opportunity for asking questions. What I tried to do here was before you can connect the dots, you have to have dots, right? So what I tried to do all along here was create dots. And now I'm hoping I'm connecting all of them. So if there's questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I just noticed that we're almost over, and we are 90% done.
And
Okay.
Al, you can keep going. Then, you know, people obviously may need to bug out, and that's okay. This is recorded, and I'll send an email later where it is. It'll be on YouTube. But if you want to hang with us, that'll be great. So yeah, Al, take your time.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. I've been telling too many stories about different plants. Sorry about that. But I think that's kind of fun. Okay, now we're going into landscape zone 3, that area out from the house, and the category of plants. You can put larger trees, larger native and adaptive shrubs, and native and adaptive grasses. So it's that area out 30 to 100 feet from the house where we manage it to have a low, and if it does catch on fire, it's going to be a low intensity fire. So I'll speed up a little bit here. Trees are well spaced. Again, like I just mentioned, we don't want ladder fuels. Ladder fuels are like when you have a shrub underneath the tree and a flame can just climb up like a ladder from the ground up into the tree. So we don't want ladder fuels. We want to prune that stuff out from underneath. Shrubs are cared for and clean. Dead wood's removed. Oops, sorry about that. The surface and ground fuels are discontinuous, and trees are pruned up. Again, like I say, 50% of the tree or 10 feet high if they're tall enough. Now I'm going to give a couple more grasses here. A native grasses, bunch.
Al, you've muted yourself.
Okay, there we go. Now I'm back on, aren't I?
Yeah.
Okay, I got to weaving my cursor around too much, and I hit the button. Sorry about that. But blue bunch wheatgrass over here is a tremendous grass that was the native grass around here and just did a great job. And it's one that you can just put, again, just a little bit of water with it throughout the season, and it'll stay green the whole growing season. Over here on the other side is Basin Wild Rye. This is one of my favorite grasses. It's really neat. It was very, very important to the Native Americans as a food source. This grass will get up to 4 to 6 feet tall. It's a big grass, and it's got a very large base. And again, you can keep this grass green all during the growing season, but if you move it far enough away from your house, you can let it dry out. It's got a very beautiful seed head that the Native Americans used a lot, used it a tremendous amount. Okay, now we're getting into trees out in zone 3. Here's a tree that I'll bet you most of you haven't ever heard of, a net leaf hackberry. This is a cool tree. It's a native tree around here. It's an eastern, it's on the shrub steppe, oftentimes grows close to riparian areas and springs and stuff like that, but it doesn't take a tremendous amount of moisture at all. A little bit of moisture, get them established, and then they're off and running. These provide a great berry for all kinds of different animals and birds, and it is a cool tree. I think they're pretty unusual. Some people say the bark is ugly, and I don't think there's such a thing as an ugly tree. Over here on the other side, we have a Pacific willow. Now that's a little different. That does take a little more moisture. These could be good to be planted in swales or places where moisture generally collects in a deeper soil. Talk about this one up in the mixed conifer zone. this is a tree that is really kind of neat. You see the size of that leaf? This is a big leaf maple, and it's a beautiful tree and very fire resistant, and really does a good job. Obviously, you got to rake it up in the fall because the leaves, you know, when they come down. Over on the other side, we got the aspen. Aspen, again, that's one of my favorite trees. All these trees are hooked together. They're all hooked together in a root system, and managing an aspen stand, what you're doing, you manage the roots. In fact, if you let mature aspen, you can protect them to death. If you let them be undisturbed, aspen will grow to about 50 years of age, and then they will start to fall apart. Every kind of bug and worm you can think of in the world lives in an aspen stand. And they are just the ultimate food source, lunch counter for birds, insects, and small mammals. They are a neat tree. They are they grow from the roots. It's called a coppice forest. Is they grow up the roots at about 1 inch in diameter underneath between these trees. That's where the sprouts come from. And so if you put them in a yard, a lot of people hate these because they take over the yard. But you can mow them down, do whatever you want. But if you have an area out back, these are a wonderful tree, and they will sprout. Once you get them established, they will do a lot of sprouting. Another tree, everybody probably recognizes this tree. This is a Ponderosa Pine. And as I said earlier, it's fire resistant, fire resilient, fire prone, fire adapted. And over on the other side, anybody recognize this? This is a re-entry space cone, the kind they used to use back in the days of Apollo. What do these two have in common? A tremendous amount. They have a tremendous amount in common. This thing, what it does, well, maybe I should start here. When the heat hits a Ponderosa pine tree, and if you can see on my hand, is for example, if I were to take a blowtorch, and if my hand was a piece of pine bark, and if I took a blowtorch and just warmed it up, the bark would flick off, just a little bit at a time. You ever notice how people call it puzzle bark on a Ponderosa pine? You heat it up and the bark flicks off. Well, you know what? They got the idea. They use that concept. The heat dissipates itself by flipping the bark as it burns. It flips it off. On the re-entry vehicles, on the space capsules, they made a metal that was made basically the same way, so that as it heated up, the pieces would flick off. You see the pieces flicking off the side here on the space capsule. And they got the idea from a Ponderosa pine tree, which I think is a pretty interesting fact. I used to demonstrate this with the kids in school all the time when I used to do those kind of things. So anyway, kind of a summary on the best fits Firewise landscape. Is in landscape zone 1, you want short vegetation with high moisture content. And as you move out into landscape zone 2 and 3, we can start introducing the shrubs and the trees and the different larger grasses and larger vegetation. Again, I just show you this as an example of where we are, so it reminds you we got the 3 different landscape zones, with the objective over here being low intensity, no spread in this one, and no ignitions in this one. So the last, well, I won't say the last, but moving towards the last concept that I wanted to cover was maintenance. I said native plants take a lot less maintenance. Any plant will burn if not properly maintained. Any native landscape will not look very appealing. How's that? I use that word. Not appealing if it's not maintained. I know some places that said we want to use all native landscaping, and then they just let it go, and it looks terrible. It looks not good at all. But if you do maintenance, and I'm not going to go through all these, but I will throw out a couple of them. One that most people are not really aware of is washing out plants, taking a garden hose. Take a garden hose with a straight string. I'm not talking about a pressure washer here. Don't use a pressure washer. Just take a garden hose and wash the plant out. Get the dead material out. It drops to the ground. Then you can go underneath and scrape all that stuff out. Sorry about that. So you can scrape all that stuff out and get the plant clean. That's an easy way to do things, and it's great to do it on hot days when you don't mind getting wet. Pruning, thinning and spacing trees out. I talked about that. Raking up weeds, mowing, weed eating. I already talked about the advantages of inorganic mulch, watering, roofs and gutters. Oh, clean up and proper yard disposal. I know of a number of people that have done an excellent job around their yard. And then they go over to the downhill side of their property and throw all the waste on the downhill side of their property. I know of some people that have lost their homes because they threw the yard waste on the downhill side and that area caught on fire, and now they got all this fuel down there that's all dry and dead, and a lot of heat coming up the hillside catches their house on fire. So properly dispose of yard waste. Okay, the value of oops, I went too fast. Just going to go through a quick one on the value of native plants. When you're using natives, they're hardy, right? They don't take a lot of things to get them established. 90% of them are 90%, 92.5%. How's that? A great deal of them are xeric. They don't take a lot of moisture. And they're fire adaptive. And most of them are fire resilient. And most of them are fire resistant. They don't take a tremendous amount of maintenance, but I think I've addressed that. They do take maintenance. They provide habitat for beneficial insects and a lot of different critters, so they're very handy and come in handy all the time. They are in harmony with the local environment, so we're not talking about introducing things that are not consistent with the environment. And for the most part, they're available locally. You don't have to order them on Amazon, so you can go get your plants locally. In fact, oops, I was going to do one more thing, these are some of the advantages, if you will, of using native plants. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't expect anybody to use 100% native plants, but I expect it's nice to use a fair amount of native plants. The last time, just to show you that home ignition zone, this is, like I say, it's based in research, all this stuff. The last thing I wanted to add into this that I haven't talked about, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly here. I've talked about how fire is coming into an area like a flaming front. The thing I did not talk about was fire embers landing near your house. This concept takes care of that. I'm going to give you a number that's probably going to scare you. 70 to 90% of all homes that burn are ignited by burning embers. Okay? 70 to 90% of homes that burn are burned by burning embers. So that's a very, very important number. If you do what I've talked about here, you don't have to worry about burning embers. This area may catch on fire, but it's going to burn at low intensity. If something lands in a bush out here, it's not going to be spreading. And if something lands close to the house, it's not going to ignite. And hopefully you got a good roof on your house, and you don't have, I'm hoping you don't have a shake roof, but if you got a Class A, and for that matter, even a Class C roof will not allow burning embers to catch on fire as long as it's clean. Okay? There was Jack Cohen, the guy I talked about. He took and put 6 inches of Ponderosa pine needles on a Class C asphalt shingle roof, lit it on fire, and let the fire back down. And as soon as that fire came off, it did not catch a fire. The roof did not catch fire, even on a Class C. A Class C is partially fire protected. A Class A roof is a fire resistant roof. I would encourage you to have Class A roofs in this particular area. So with that, I am done. And here are some references of reading material that you might care to use. I am going. This is a book that put together a couple of years ago. It's in fact one of the interesting things. I'm working with the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, right now to make this Eastern Washington wide. We're working on getting this thing put together. But this is a book put together by the Master Gardeners. It's available on the Cascadia Conservation District site. And there's a couple other brochures. I had mentioned Arbovita. It's a plant torch. This is available also on the website. Here's another one. If it's got a lot of what's in the book, if you're just looking for a few plants that you might want to consider. So with that, that is the end of my presentation, and I went over by 16 minutes. Are there questions?
Yeah, Al, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to go back up the list here. Is Woods Rose native or naturalized?
It's a native.
Okay.
It is a native. It is all over the West. It's in every state. I've worked in almost every Western state, and it is throughout the West.
And can you talk about bitterbrush and how to manage it for fire?
Yeah. Bitterbrush is one of my favorites, as a matter of fact. Bitterbrush is a very fire-prone species. I would, in fact, one of the things, bitterbrush with pine needles draped in it is probably the most volatile fuel that we have in the state of Washington. The only way you can make it worse is put a little cheatgrass on the ground. So it can move around on the ground and then get into the bitterbrush with the pine needles. You will have a 30 to 40 foot flame length. Think about that, a 30 to 40 foot flame length with needle draped bitterbrush. I love bitterbrush. It is a great winter feed for deer. And one of the things I would offer on bitterbrush, only some bitterbrush plants are grazed. You can look at, or browsed, I should say, browsed, is you can walk around and look at bitterbrush plants and you can tell if they're being used by wildlife. Some bushes will get heavily grazed and the one right next to it will never be grazed. So if you're thinking about doing some thinning of shrubs, look at the plant. Look at the plant. You can tell if they've been grazed. When deer graze browse on a bitterbrush, they break it off and they rip the plant, the twig, if you will. And you can see a little ripping on it. So look for the plants that have been used a fair amount, and you want to save those. You can thin around them. You can prune them up a little bit from the ground, but don't do a lot to it. But thin everything around it and leave those plants. And if you look at the ones around it, I'll bet you notice they're not grazed at all. Really interesting. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Robbie, if you're here, still here, do you want to have any other questions about that?
Okay.
He does. Yeah, go ahead.
Bitterbrush is an extremely flammable plant. It has both a chemical composition that makes it flammable, plus the way it is arranged, the way the plant is built. So it's not a good one to have close to your house.
Someone asked for that.
All right. And somebody was asking about spacing for trees.
Okay. A good space is it depends on the tree. How's this? Is as a when you're like I say, it depends on what your objective, but a good rule of thumb is double the diameter of a tree. Okay, so if you have a tree that's 4 inches in diameter, you want to make sure they're a minimum of 8 feet apart, okay? But once they start growing, then you need to make sure you got room between the. This is a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer. I'll give you another way to do that. Keep 10 feet between the crowns. That's probably the easiest way to answer that question. On a tree, keep 10 feet between, a minimum of 10 feet between the crowns. If you think of a tree, it's called a dominant tree. It means it's getting sun from all the way around. A codominant tree means it's only getting sun from 3 sides. You don't want that in your landscape. You want to open it up so that it becomes a dominant tree, that it's getting sun all the way around the top of the crown and on the sides, and make sure there's a minimum of 10 feet between the crowns of larger trees. Somebody asked for my contact information.
Yeah.
I thought I had it up. How do I do this? My telephone number is 509-670-3151. My email is murphbear@hotmail.com. murphbear@hotmail.com. I don't mind you calling me. Are there other questions?
Yeah, Deborah asked about trees on steep slope further apart like shrubs.
Yes. Yes, when you put anytime you steepen the slope, you don't only have radiant energy in effect, you also have conduction is hot air rises, right? So when you start steepening a slope, the effects of the radiation as well as the convection, not conduction, convective heat moving up is, so what you want to start doing, I think that slide shows, but once you start getting on steep slopes, you want that distance to be about 8 times what it is on flat ground. You know, I say twice the distance on flat ground. You want to move those about 8 times on steep ground, as a general rule of thumb. Okay.
All right. Can you comment about your opinion of city government's role in regarding Firewise landscaping?
Oh, yes. Let me offer you some thoughts, and I didn't get into this for a variety of reasons. But if you think about who owns that home ignition zone, that's the landowner. The land, somebody, whoever owns that house generally owns that home ignition zone. So I would offer, nobody else has any authority over that than the homeowner or the landowner. Next, step B, structure fire departments are taught how to put out house fires. Generally, that's an interior type of deal, where they go into a house and try to put out a fire, or try to put the interior of a fire, the interior of a house out. The training expertise is on structure control. Does that make sense? Wildland agencies, the Forest Service, BLM, the DNR, they're taught how to control the perimeter, how to stop a fire from moving forward. They're always working on perimeter control, trying to stop a fire from getting bigger. Challenging task many, many times. So if you think about it, there is a gap. There's a gap between the wildland agencies and the structure agencies. The reason that gap exists, for the most part, we want control, we as individuals want control of our private land. We don't want people telling us what to do. So therefore, along with authority, there has to be some responsibility. And so that responsibility in my opinion, falls on the landowner. Is cities try to implement, counties, DNRs across the West, try to implement codes. There's a National Fire Protection, NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, has some universal codes on urban wildland interface. They're in effect in California and everywhere else in the world. Are they working? I don't think so. Until homeowners recognize that the gap is there and is their responsibility, they are the ones with authority to do the landscaping around their home. By the way, with implementing the steps that I've talked about here this evening, there is a 97% chance that a house will survive the most tragic and catastrophic fires. There's never going to be a 100% chance, but there's a 97% chance by following those general guidelines, a home will survive almost passively without a fire truck sitting there in the yard. That is what I think the message needs to be delivered and received by homeowners. That's it. That makes sense? What else?
Roseanne asked how tall those trees grow, but was from a while back, so I'm not sure which trees those are. But Roseanne, if you want to jump in and clarify.
I would guess she's talking about the Leaf Hackberry. They only get, under ideal conditions, which I've never seen, under ideal conditions, they can get up to probably 40 feet tall. I don't think I've ever seen one over 20 feet tall. I've been around a lot of them out in the wild, and I don't think I've ever seen one 20 feet tall. But like I say, according to the book, they can get up to about 40 feet. That's a Leaf Hackberry.
What about Pacific Willow?
Ooh, Pacific Willow can get big. They can probably go 40 to 60 feet.
All right. I think we have all the questions, unless I missed one, but if anybody else has any questions or I missed it, stick it back there in the chat.
Why is the chat not showing up on my screen?
Yeah, when you're sharing, it gets hidden pretty well. Yeah. If you want to unshare, you could.
Well, I guess I could do that.
So we were recording this, so we're going to post that in our YouTube channel. I'll send an email out with the link to that once we have it up there. I posted, and I'll put it on here again, a Google Doc that has clickable links with the resources that Al had at the end of his slide presentation, and I'll also send. He's going to get me a PDF version of it, and I'll send that out as well. So, any final questions?
I would offer, but please, if I didn't get into the real technical side of this, and I have that presentation that talks about all the technical side of the fire resistance and protecting your home and that type of thing. If somebody'd like to hear that, that'd be fine. But I thought this was more appropriate for this audience.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Al, and everybody else. Hope to see you next week as well. And certainly I'll send that information out to you once I get it. So thanks for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Al. That was great. Thanks for joining, everyone. Talk to you next week.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks.
You bet.